So welcome everybody. So welcome to this first seminar in a new series. This is sponsored by the Cardamom project, which is an IRC project looking at how we can use natural language processing to help with historical and minority languages. So we see under-resourced languages as a real challenge, for the future of NLP. And we have a similar challenge both for minoritized communities, but also for historical communities, in that we have limits on the corpus, the resources. So this IRC project, which is hosted at the Data Science Institute at NUI Galway, is looking into this challenge. And as part of this, we're organizing this seminar series, inviting researchers to come give, researchers who are looking into this question to come to give talks, to kind of explain their working and the kind of things that they're doing in order to improve how NLP works for these languages. So we're hoping this will be a monthly thing. So we'll send around a notification or an invite again for the next one. So through some of the same mailing lists. So I think there was quite a few project mailing lists we used for this one, and we seem to have got a nice turnout. So I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Molina-Mun tonight. She is a researcher at the University of Oxford looking at Sanskrit. She did a PhD in linguistics from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. So she's looked at syntactic phenomena and how these also affect other components of language faculty, such as morphology and semantics and pragmatics, looking at both synchronic and diachronic interfaces, looking at phenomena such as word order and compounding, ergativity and such like. This has been mostly focused on Sanskrit and Hindi. He also worked on things like Bribri, which is the language of Costa Rica. So a very interesting talk tonight, looking at the syntax of classical Sanskrit. So I'd like to thank Dr. Molina for agreeing to give this talk, and please go ahead.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much for having me. I'm going to share my presentation now, and we can start. So I was very interested in when I got the invitation to this series, because I started working on corpus properly a few years back when I fell in love with Hindi. So I was working on Sanskrit, fell in love with Hindi, started studying. And then the question is, okay, how do I elicit data in a more reliable way than just pure acceptability judgments or grammaticality judgments, especially being a non-native speaker of the language, which is quite unusual if you look at the work that is out there for syntax. So I started studying a little bit of programming, statistics, trying to figure out how to handle this. So I'm not by any means a programmer. I just like a guerrilla attitude, just trying to do and learn on the way. But a lot of what I learned there, I've actually been applying at the current project that I'm going to discuss today. So what I want to discuss is specifically about what is available out there when we want to work on a specific area of syntax, which is very tricky, not that common. And we can see that there are more like projects on dialectology, phonology, typology, etc., right? Not usually on syntax. And what are the tools out there that we can use, and which are the limitations? And in particularly, I'm presenting some discussion from a diachronic and synchronic perspective. So what you already know about is that the fields of corpus linguistics and NLP has a banded array of methods for studying these different aspects of language, either using large or small collection of text or corpora in general. And that can be written, it can be spoken. So nowadays, for just a very limited amount of languages, we have large databases which are representative, they can be machine readable. We also have parsers, taggers for such corpora, and there are
Adriana, you appear to have gone on mute.
okay. How did that happen? Sorry about that. So I don't know when did that happen, but I'm gonna just repeat a little bit.
Just 5 seconds ago, don't worry.
Okay, good. So as I said, for this talk, I just want to present some of the challenges that in our experience in this project, and the project is Uncovering Sanskrit Syntax from the University of Oxford, which is funded by Leverhulme Trust Fund. And the team is composed by John Lowe, who is the PI, myself, and Antonia Ruppel. And this is the first large corporate study on Sanskrit syntax that it has been done. So since it's the first, you can imagine how many difficulties we have encountered just trying to do this in such a large scale. Now, let me start, before I start with the project, with some of the challenges that exist per se when we talk about corpus and syntax. So from a synchronic perspective, the notion of corpus represents a long-standing and controversial matter. So it hasn't always been accepted that corpus data actually is important for syntactic analysis. At first, or during a very large period with the structuralist data, corpus data was widely used, but there was this misconception that all these texts available were actually representative of the whole set for the language and for that particular group of people. But then Chomsky criticized, argued against this notion of corpus, and he said, well, this actually, the capacity that, the language capacity that these speakers, native speakers have, cannot be reduced to a limited number of utterances that you can find in a corpus, right? So this idea of what is being called the armchair linguist, which is that linguist either working on its own language through introspection, right? And that's why usually when you find syntacticians working on Hindi are usually native speakers of Hindi, syntacticians working on Spanish are native speakers Spanish. And it's this idea that you just think about the sentences, the constructions, and trust your intuition as a native speaker of the language, right? And if you want to elicit it, then because you're not a native speaker of that language, then you try to elicit grammaticality or what is often also called acceptability judgments from the speakers. So why bother with corpus and dealing with large amounts of data if it's as easy of just sitting and thinking for a few minutes, right, of a few sentences? Well, because the speaker's judgments are not always reliable, especially when it comes to oral and non-normative languages. So if you have experience doing field work, you have probably encountered this issue that the speaker will tell you, oh, no, I will never say that because that's ungrammatical, right? You shouldn't say that. But then when the interview stops or when you're in a more informal setting, you actually hear the speaker using the construction, right? You also have variability from within this grammaticality judgments from one speaker to another. And then also, and this is very important, and I found it in my own research, like to be a very big contribution from corpus, and is that introspective data cannot be objectively verified. So corpus actually is a very good tool to do this, to be able to check whatever intuitions have been, elicited from the speakers. Also, another advantage of corpus is that they can also encompass the actual language uses from different genre, registers, from different regions, periods, etc., right? So at the end, within synchronic syntactic studies, corpus is very helpful in investigating predictions that have already made, search for rare constructions that are actually quite difficult to elicit it when you are in a fieldwork setting, and also to be able to just extract enough data that you can actually do more sophisticated statistical analysis. So that's for the synchronic perspective. As for the diachronic syntactic perspective, well, it seems to be quite obvious, right? Because historical linguists, we cannot do linguistics of our work without corpora, without the manuscript, without the text or registers from different periods from a particular language. So it will seem that this is historical linguistics is actually like a subset or a sub area of corpus studies. But actually, what is interesting is that in practice, and I see this all the time in either even nowadays in academic journals, historical linguists don't tend to follow like the strict methodologies that have been implemented in corpus linguistics. So no real attempts have been made or are made sometimes to produce samples that are representative. They only focus on one text. And even if they have access to others, they just don't do it quite systematically. Now, traditionally, they have been identified like three main dangers associated with historical corpus. And I don't know if you have heard of them, but one of them is the Philologist Dilemma, right? So this idea that if we rely on a specific corpus and on some, for example, Python or some programming language to extract only a few set or a set of data, then we are going to miss the whole beauty of the text, right? Like the whole context and the whole pragmatic semantics of the text. And this is actually a quite interesting dilemma. It's a dilemma that we face every day in our project. Why? Because the project is composed by two linguists and one philologist. I myself have a background in philology, in classical philology. So is this idea that, okay, how much can we actually say about the language without looking into the context or without, considering or discussing all the possible pragmatic interpretations and semantic interpretations of this particular sentence, or why, or if we are actually misleading the reader into believing that this is representative of Sanskrit as a whole. So this is actually one problem or danger that is quite relatable. And as I said, we in our project actually discuss this quite often. The other one is God's true fallacy. As I said, so a corpus may be used to provide representative conclusions about the entire language period. The other one is the mystery of vanishing reliability. Now, 2 and 3 are actually problems that can be easily solved, especially when you expand the range of texts of the corpora. But one seems to be one of those questions that keep being raised in not only the project, but in the literature. So as I said, this one-to-one relationship between corpus and syntax, either synchronic, from a synchronic perspective or diachronic perspective, is not that simple, has been complicated over time, historically, right? So there are advantages and disadvantages, and people have argued in favor against the use of corpora in both settings. Now, what about Sanskrit? Because this is what we are talking about today. So what is Sanskrit? I assume that most of you are familiar with this language. So Sanskrit is a classical language of South Asia. It belongs to the Indo-Aryan branch of the Indo-European languages. Is the sacred language of Hinduism, also the language of classical Hindu philosophy, and some historical texts of Buddhism and Jainism also were written in Sanskrit. So you can, just by this, you can imagine the amount of text that is available first when you want to study or work on Sanskrit. We recognize, or in general, we recognize two varieties. One is the Vedic Sanskrit variety, which whose oldest text is the Rig Veda. It's a collection of hymns that dates around 1500 BC. And the other variety of Sanskrit that is widely recognized is classical Sanskrit. And actually, a lot of times, many times, when people talk about Sanskrit, they're talking about classical Sanskrit, because Vedic Sanskrit per se has a lot of distinctive features, either in phonology and in the lexicon. There is a lot of regional variety too in the manuscripts. So when people often refer to Sanskrit, they mainly refer to classical Sanskrit. So one interesting question when you want to work on Sanskrit is, what is available, right? And this is a question that probably pertains also to this group. You guys are interested in creating these tools, make them available for languages that are underrepresented, right? So actually, there is quite a lot, but not enough, or not good enough, or better said, not precisely what a linguist would need in order to be able to produce some meaningful research. So some of what is out there is the digital corpus of Sanskrit, and I'll discuss a little bit about what this standard split corpus means. But this is a very good tool, but it's embedded within their interface. So it's very hard. I mean, you can download some of the text, but you can actually not perform other operations on their interface other than the ones that are already preset. So it's not quite helpful for us as a group. Then the Gretel, and this is actually quite helpful because it's a repository of e-texts. So these are Sanskrit texts that are available, digitally available, and are machine readable. So they are searchable, which is really important for us. There is also the SADIT project, which also is a very important and extensive repository of e-texts. They argue that the texts are markup or tag, but actually they're not, and I'll discuss a little bit about this too. There is another source or text for materials, which comes from Titus. And this is a free service. I mean, all of these are free. You can just use them for academic purposes without paying. And also they have, especially for Vedic texts, Titus is a very good source. For the classical ones, I will rather use the previous three ones. Another good source is the Cologne Digital Sanskrit Lexicon project, because what they did is that they digitalized many of the relevant dictionaries. It's very easy to look for words, especially when you're working with large amounts of texts. And another good source is the Sanskrit Heritage site, and this was made in France, so it's English and French. It's bilingual, and they offer a series of tools that are good if you use them within the interface, but then you cannot extract it and apply it to the text that you already have. So there are some limitations here. So there is the Sanskrit Reader, which is a parser. There is a dictionary, digitalized. There is the Sanskrit Grammarian, which is actually quite helpful. It's a declension engine. Lemmatizer, which tag inflected words. And they also have a Sanskrit portal with a lot of resources about academic programs, people working on Sanskrit, etc. So as you can see, is not your classical undocumented language, because Sanskrit itself consists of a very large amount of text, right? Not all of those texts have been digitalized, but we can find actually quite a healthy amount online. We'll see that it's not as straightforward, but you can find a lot actually online. Now, our project. So we intended to conduct asynchronic analysis of Sanskrit. And I'm going to go back and forth with this idea and what does that mean when you start a corpus and then analyze it. But we wanted to just create our own corpus. Why? Because the ones that are available online are usually embedded in a particular interface, as I said, so there is not much you can do. I mean, whatever you can do is limited to the word searches or statistics within that interface, right? But we want to do more than that to the text. We want to extract information that is not offered by this platform. So we created our own corpus. How do we do that? Well, we search all the major online databases. We first saw what is out there, which is a little bit of what is out there is what I presented before. We decided then which text to use. So we used criteria such as dates. Not all texts have been dated, which is a problem if you want to conduct a particular, or we are to conduct research only on historical basis, because then not the Vedic tag or the classical Sanskrit tags are not enough, right? You need to have like a better timeline, the distribution of this text, and ideally also regional information, which we don't have for most of these texts. And we also consider the style. So if it was a verse, or what is called mantra, or if it was prose. Because we expected that with mantra text, especially when we work with syntax, syntax is rarely studied within mantra or verse. Why? Because metric requirements can actually affect syntactic distribution, like, for example, linearization, right? Or word order. So we wanted to have a healthy mix of both of them and see if there was a difference. Then we check about getting the permission to access the text, which is not a problem. We also had to unify the format, and this was very challenging. So which are these challenges? Well, the first one is, how are these texts available? Are they available in Devanagari? And this is an example of this is presented here. So, or is this formatted in the International Alphabet for Sanskrit, or in other words, the Romanized version of the text? We decided to skip Devanagari. In my previous research with Hindi, I work extensively with text in Devanagari, and they tend to be very problematic with some programming languages and with some processes. So we just decided to skip that part, just unify all the text with a particular Unicode, and also reformat the text when it was necessary. What do I mean by reformatting? Well, some text appeared PDF, some appear in text, some in XML. So we just unified. We pick one formatting, which is text, and then also we use the same Unicode for all, because not all these texts use the same. And we also had to define the domains of the search. And if you can see here in these examples, there is sometimes just one line that's usually a dot, like a punctuation in Sanskrit. And then the double dot is also a punctuation, is either when the mantra ends or is like when a separate paragraph starts. So what happened is that some texts had the Western punctuation and other texts had the traditional Sanskrit punctuation. So we wanted to just unify that. So it will be easier when we just create a quote, right? Because otherwise we'll have problems extracting the data. So we did that. And then the major problem that we actually had by creating the corpus is that the formatting wasn't unified in terms of a very particular aspect of Sanskrit, and that is sandhi. So what does sandhi mean? Sandhi is when you put two things together. It's a fusion. And you probably are familiar with the term if you study some phonology. Okay, so Sanskrit has what is called internal Sanskrit. So if you have a word that is a compound and the two words are put together within the word, then they are put together, merged phonetically using one set of rules. And this set of rules are called internal sandhi. But Sanskrit also put together separate words within a sentence. And that's the tricky part. So for example, here you can see two examples of external sandhi. So you have gachati ishvaraha. So this in the traditional Sanskrit text would appear as gachati ishvaraha, like all together. But in reality, we have a verb and a noun, right? Separate syntactically. So some text will have it as gachati and ishvaraha separate. Another text will not undo the sandhi and will have them together. So this was something that we have to solve with the coding and the search, because we could not unify this aspect of the formatting. You will need a particular tool that has been tested in GNU, but only with a very small amount of data. So it was not very reliable. And we didn't want to spend too much time dealing with this. So the decision that we made was that we, in the searches, so for example, for the causatives in Sanskrit, right? So we will want to search for every single causative form in all the tenses and for all the first, second, third person, singular, plural, in all its sandhi variations. So you can imagine that the list for the searches were quite extensive. And what we did was just to generate it using also either Python or Mathematica, which is the other software that I am familiar with. So I just generated, like the sandhi forms and then the conjugations automatically without having to do this by hand. And the idea behind this is that it was better to overgenerate, right? Like to have the possibility that the search will provide us with a lot of false positive rather than undergenerate and having to deal with adding data later that we missed because we reduced the search too much. So this is actually was quite a complication with the corpus, and is a complication for whatever you want to do with Sanskrit texts, because this is the reality of the language. Now we ended up creating a corpus of around 5.5 million words, covering a period of over 3,000 years. Now, as I said, not all of these texts were unsandhied. So you can imagine that this is a very, not very reliable approximate of the number of words. Why? Because in some instances, for the Lord goes, it will be at gachati ishvaraha. So it will be, the program will consider this a whole word, even though it was two. And for other instances, he will just consider it with the unsanded. So this is a very rough estimate. of the corpus. And we included around 150 texts total. And these texts included the Mahabharata, for example, Ramayana. Just to put it into perspective, like how much data we can actually cover by doing this, by using corpus and then more automatic methods or tools. Just imagine that just the Mahabharata is 12 times the Iliad and the Odyssey together. Okay, those are two Greek works. So just imagine that just one of the 150 texts is that big. So in the past, before having access to these digital versions, you will just have to go and read everything and take years doing that. So for example, one of the translations of the Ramayana, it took 15 years to translate. So you have an idea of how big these texts really are. And this 5.5 million words estimate is not that reliable because of the Sanskrit or because of the Sandhi. And as I said, these are, maybe they sound like a very basic problems or challenges when you work with data, but we have been the first ones actually dealing with this. So we had to be creative in how to go around this without having to actually have to create a tagger, because that will take years, right? Months, and have to hire someone, computer science, to do. And we only have 3 years for this project. So actually we needed to gather data fast and be able to search it fast and analyze it also fast. So I'm going to show you one of the first topics or problems, syntactic problems that we work on with using the corpus. And this is the passive causatives in Sanskrit. Now we have, since then, we have worked on control, and by the end of the year, we'll start working with anaphora. And every time that we change the topic, of course, the challenges also change in terms of how we start with the searches, how do we deal with the whole positive, etc. Right? So here I just picked this, which is like the first case, the first problem we treated, and also because after reviews we have been able to re-examine what we've done, add some more roots to the search, also rethink about whatever little statistics we were doing, and we can now discuss everything we did wrong from the beginning with better perspective than we were a year ago. So this is, as I said, the case of Sanskrit Causative. What is a causative? So a causative is when you make someone to do something, right? So for example, we have the verb to enter. So the normal, simple declination will be he enters, right? But the causative form of that will be someone else causes someone else to enter, or I cause someone else to enter. And Sanskrit also have a passive of that. So someone is caused to enter. Having the active and the passive is not that common typologically. So this is actually a very interesting case in Sanskrit when we have both forms being used quite productively. Okay, so this is an opportunity to see how the causative, active, and the passive interact, if they actually do interact. So how do we see this interaction? Well, first, when we look at the active causative, in theory, there are two possible argument structures that we can have when they are formed to transitive verbs. One is when you have two accusative. Accusative is like a declension for objects, right? So for example, in 1b, you have Jashdata makes Devadatta cut the wood. And the one who is made to do something will be the accusative, and the object of the action will also be accusative. But then Sanskrit also allowed other argument and structure, and that is with an instrument and accusative. So is when Devadatta is actually in an instrument case, and what is the object of the action is in accusative. That's for the active. For the passive, we also have two possible structures. One is, as the regular passive, we know that there is promotion of the object, demotion of the subject, right? In other words, what is to be the object now is the subject of the sentence. So we call that PCS. PCO. When it's the previous object of the sentence, will become the subject. And in the cases when we had the previous subject, the subject is the one who is caused to do something, right? So if that is the subject of the passive, we call this PCS. And the theory or the hypothesis here is that if you have in the active the possibility of two, or the marking of two objects, when it comes to the passive, the preferred structure will be PCS. But if you only have instrumental and accusative, then the preferred construction in the passive will be PCO. Okay? So two possible objects, then the subject object will be the one being the subject of the passive. But if you only have one object, then only that object can be the subject of the passive. Now, we ask the question, can we account for the choice of one structure over the other? And look at this question is synchronic, purely synchronic. So how do we do? Well, you can see here in the table, maybe not very well, but I just wanted to quickly show you how we organize all the possible roots. So we came up with a list using the grammars available in Sanskrit, especially Witness, which is from the 1885. And we say, okay, so all these roots can have this causative form. Some of these roots are transitive. Some of these roots are intransitive. Some of the roots can be both. So we say, okay, we are going to remove intransitive roots. Why? Because we will not be able to test all the possible participants, right? The one making someone else to do something because it's intransitive. So we remove that. Then for the searches, we wanted to remove all those forms in which there was not a formal distinction between the passive causative and the regular passive. So we got rid of those forms. And we also got rid of the forms that didn't have any tokens, right, in the general search. So that's why you can see here in this column like the number of tokens per root. And it doesn't matter if at this point some or most of them will be false positives, but we just wanted to have a sense of what was out there for each root, right? So from around 300 roots, possible roots in all the tenses and in active and passive, we ended up only working with 13 roots. And here is when people had actually criticized this work, because they say, okay, you're doing the statistical work, you're doing corpus studies, but why so little data at the end, right? So you're working with 5.5 million words corpus, but then you're just limited to 13 roots. And this results for an actually very meticulous investigation of the uses. What we realize is that most of these roots, most of these forms, even though they had the formal causative, they didn't have a causative meaning. Okay, they didn't have the remotely the argument structure for the causative. Also, not all of these roots allowed for a passive causative, so that also remove a lot of options. Now, when it comes to the analysis, I created a code so it would extract the form, it would extract the line. So we wanted to be able to go back to the text if we needed to check the context, right? So having the line was very helpful. And also knowing if it was, you can see here, classical, narrative, and the name of the text, which is also very important because once you have the patterns, you want to be able to visualize this and see if the data, the genre is making a difference, the period is making a difference in the structures. So that's how we organize it. And the other part that I want to mention before I just move along is that you see here the translation. We use translations because that's the only way we can actually cross-check our analysis of the constructions. Why is that? Because if we don't do this, all of us know Sanskrit. We're very proficient, highly proficient in Sanskrit. But we were afraid that we will impose that, for example, in this case, the causative meaning of the form. And we wanted to check if this causative meaning was always present or not. So we did that by cross-referencing our analysis with the translations available. Now, I want to discuss just very quickly because of the time about the results, is that this, in table 1, these two things are the ones that we were looking for. Okay, this was the desired argument structure that we wanted to compare of the active with the passive. But if you look at the numbers, they are very low. If we look at the other range of possible argument and structure that we actually found in Sanskrit, you'll see that it's completely a different story of what we were thinking to find. So what we found is that Sanskrit just sometimes or most of the times omits either one or all the arguments. And that's not very helpful for what we wanted to discover, right? Because that gives us with little to none data to actually be able to prove our hypothesis. So we did this analysis. We got the frequencies for the active and the passives. I'm not going to get into that. And the way that we thought that we could compare this data, since we didn't have the desirable argument structure, we had to just see, okay, what is Sanskrit telling me here then with this omission of the arguments? We wanted to start with a very basic statistical method, which is like correlation matrix. So this is sometimes like a first step to see if there is anything else. But then we've been going back and forth with this because we're working with frequency data and it has a lot of theoretical methodological problems. One is the Zipf's distribution problem. Also, we need to deal with the linearity if we want to apply certain statistical methods. We tried using proportions. We tried also using the log transformation. And now we are in the stage revisiting this, trying to see if some of the patterns that occur using, for example, raw frequencies are maintained using log transformation or proportions, and two types of proportions. We wanted to also see if there was a variation there. But right now, we are not being very successful with this part. We can discuss that in the questions. So what have we learned from this experience, from the challenges that were there before we even started the project and the challenges that have arisen with the project? Well, one to be aware of is the limitations of corpora. Even though Sanskrit actually has lots of text available in digital format, those texts are not annotated. And if they are somehow annotated or parsed, they're usually embedded into interfaces that cannot be extracted. Maybe you could ask for them to let you use the data, but it's a little bit more complicated. Um, Also, you have to deal with the representativity of the data set that you're using, with the corpus that you're using, have been very aware of that. And also be very aware of distinguishing how you obtain the data. So in this case, we use corpora, not elicitation, we can't. But also distinguish that from how you evaluate the data. And in this case, in particular, we're using frequencies, right? Um, and you can see that we've been running into some of the issues with that. And one of the interesting observations that we concluded here with this project is that this illusion that you can actually do big data easily or from the start, because there are series of theoretical and methodological limitations when doing that. And again, I go back to the ideal scenario would be having annotated on that corpus, but that occurs only for very, very, very limited amount of languages in the world. And also an also interesting discussion that we often have in the team is what kind of study are we doing, synchronic or diachronic? Because the questions are clearly synchronic, but the type of data is not necessarily, right? Because we're working with two different varieties and we're working with different genre and different periods. So we often have comments about what processes have happened here in the syntax and if these are actually historical changes. And also in this idea that big data is how relevant doing statistics really is when the amount of data that you had collected at the end is so limited, right? And I have here some of the conclusions from the actual investigation, but I think I'm going to stop here and just refer to them in case someone has a question.
Okay, thank you. That's a great talk, really interesting and really interesting area to be working on. So yeah, so if anyone has questions, you can raise your hand. I think there's a raise hand button at the bottom.
I hope I didn't overwhelm everyone because I know it's a lot of details.
Okay, so I see Sina, you have a question?
Hi, Adriana. Thank you very much. It was wonderful. I really liked that presentation, and it was very informative also. I learned a lot. Based on I'm a native speaker of Kurdish, and I'm also interested in all the linguistic knowledge that we also need in NLP. Don't you think the variation between PCS and PCO is kind of the frequency of that depends on the verb also? Because in the case of Kurdish, for example, we may have PCS, PCO, but it highly depends on the verb also.
Yes, and as a matter of fact, when we look at what is been in the Indian grammatical tradition, the main position from Panini was grouping verbs based on their semantics and then correlating that with the argument structure in the active causative. And I would even expand that and say that we have found evidence about animosity and then also some pragmatic uses that are conditioning or could be conditioning alternation between the PCO and PCS. So it's not just semantics, it seems to be also pragmatics. Mm-hmm. But then the issue is that that's a different question, right? And that requires also looking at this data differently. What do I mean by that? Well, as you can see in, let me see the example here when we analyze the data. So usually we have the immediate context and the translation, right? So when we need to check the wider discursive context, we don't go beyond 20 lines or the previous mantra, the previous paragraph. But when you want to do a real pragmatic study, then you have to actually consider the whole text. We also saw, for example, the use of the imperative in certain narrative texts. So, for example, the king said that he should be killed, right? Or he is caused to be killed. And these kind of commands, which are very impersonal, and you omit all the participants because you know the order is being given by the king. It doesn't matter who is, maybe what matters is who is going to die, but it doesn't matter who kills, right? Who is going to hand this person or kill this person. So actually there is a lot of pragmatic and discourse motivation for the omission of this and for the alternation. But we haven't been able to find a specific pattern because even semantically, they don't behave as they should, as Panini told us, or as we would expect.
All right. Thank you very much. I think it's very interesting to extend this project on other languages and also to study other notions in syntax from a corpus and analysis point of view. I can understand it can be very complex. So well done.
Okay. Doris, you have a question?
Yeah, just turn on my camera. I hope the sound works. Thanks, Adriana. It was very interesting. Nice combination, I think, or integration of quantitative and qualitative research. I'm a postdoc on the Cardamom project, and I'm particularly or personally very interested in morphology. Now, I think in the beginning you mentioned that where you were discussing external and internal sandhi phenomena, that you had tried to use some technology that had been available, but that wasn't, you weren't successful in automating everything. Is it?
I mean, there have been several articles out there, and the main creators of these parsers, they are from GNU, so they're the ones working mainly on this for Sanskrit. But the success rate of these parsers are not high, and also they are limited by genre. They only work on prose, and they have only worked in like few lines in an already annotated corpus, which, I mean, limits all the possibilities, right? Because in an ideal world, then I have this parser and I'm able to just apply it to the corpus I have, right? If it fulfills certain formal requirements. And then I just have a step forward into this, right? Like I undo my sandhi and all this. But it has not worked as well as we wished, so.
Yeah, it's funny because I just looked at my own PhD and I did some background study, and I actually found a reference to Gérard Huet, or Huet.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know if you know him, but he seemed to have done a lot on rule-based morphological parsing for Sanskrit. But I don't know, you probably know him, but I was just wondering.
Yes, and
his stuff was useful.
What he has done is available at the Sanskrit Heritage site that I mentioned. So that is the IMRIA, and he's been the head of that project. And he has created a parser, but mainly for what he calls the Sanskrit reader, which is like a very old grammar, like a Sanskrit reader. And then he applied the tagger and the parser there. But it has not been applied to more data. Again, I mean, these are just fragments of text. The problem is that I don't believe that is being a parser there or is out there, and correct me if I'm wrong if you have encountered the opposite, but that is out there that has a significant training data set and has actually a success like a high success rate in training that data set. So I think that's the major problem. That
So it's not
has been quite small.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, it's just out of interest. Yeah, I have nothing to contribute, unfortunately. But thanks anyway. Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, thanks. So okay, I mean, I had a question. So I mean, when you're bringing this corpus together, one thing that we've seen a lot when I work with Old Irish is a question of how diplomatic this corpus is, particularly how much it keeps, maybe errors that are in the original manuscript, and the degree to which editors have added in things that they think should be there. And I was wondering what you thought about that in terms of your corpus construction procedure. What did you? Is it sort of standardized or corrected by the editors, or is it staying more true to the original manuscripts?
All of the above.
Okay.
If that's a valid question. Yes, I mean, because in order to create our corpus, we went to Gretel, Titus, and different sources, right? And because we wanted to just have a wider range of text, so that forced us to go out there and then just use as much as it was available. So some of them have been checked and proofread, and some of them have not. So quite often we find errors, but they have not been that significant for what we are doing. So we just fix them, just go back to check the manuscript, see what it is. I think there was one text we were having more issues with, and that was a Buddhist. We didn't classify it as a purely Buddhist text, but we included in the range of what could have some Buddhist features, right? So that text in particular had shows a little bit of difficulties. At the end, we just ended up removing it based on the fact that, okay, this is Buddhist Sanskrit and this is the only text and this is not relevant for us right now. Because we were very representative in terms of Vedic and Classical Sanskrit. So, and we also limited in terms of the dates. So we didn't include any commentaries and we didn't include anything beyond the 1300. So yes, I mean, we had everything. Some of them have been checked, and especially the digital corpus of Sanskrit, some of the text, I mean, most of the texts are incomplete, but the ones that are complete is very nice because they have done a critical edition with the text. So you can actually compare the different manuscripts that are available. But again, the usage is limited to their interface. I mean, you could ask for the text and all that, right? You could do that. But the main purpose is more like checking it within their interface. But I use it quite often just to contrast whatever we have, and whenever is a problem, a dispute with the manuscript, then we just go and check with them. So it's a very good resource.
Okay, great. That's great. Do we have another question? I see Doris, you still have your hand raised, but I think that was from previously. Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah. Nice. If not, I have another question. So, I mean, your study was limited to 13 forms. So, I mean, what was holding you back to only 13 forms? What would you have needed to do, say, 100 verbs? I mean, what was the challenge there?
Yes, as I said, so we started with over 300 roots. But then we included even the theoretical forms. What do we mean by that? Forms that the grammarians talk about. Yeah, you can say this, for example, right? So X said, yes, you can say a causative of there is a causative of this verb, but no one had found ever in a text. So for our search, we included those theoretical forms or possible forms. But at the end, they were not there, right, in any of the texts. And then since we excluded intransitive verbs, then that removed a lot of the forms. Then for those verbs that they could be transitive or intransitive, when we started analyzing the forms, we found out that the causative was based on the intransitive form and not the transitive. So we had to remove all those forms. And at the end, we ended up with only 13 forms that were genuinely causatives. And again, this is important also to mention that if we were only focusing on causative in Sanskrit, the selection of the data would have been completely different. But we were focusing on passive causative. So if those verbs didn't have a passive causative, then we will not even look at them. Okay. So that's why we ended up from 300 possible roots to 13 roots.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, it's obviously a challenge. I mean, the data sparsity, you don't always have all the data you need. And as you say, with historical languages, there's not any more data coming that's anyway.
And it's not like you can go and ask people around, right? Can you say this? Or in the zeros, I mean, there is a 50-50 chance that this can be either of those two argument structures we were interested in, right? When we compare with the passive, we kind of use some statistics to be quite confident what could have been, but it will be just pure stipulation.
Okay. So I think Atul has a question here now.
Yeah. Hi. Hi, Adriana.
Hello.
So I agree with you. JNU and heritage sites is not properly updated, and even if you check Bakulkardi website, it is not properly working for the morphological analyzer and generator.
Yes.
But as I know, some tools is already available in the NPTL, National Portal of Translation Languages initiative by Government of India. You can check, and it is available for the academic purpose. You can use just update, and basically you can install in your system and upgrade your platform. And so this is just information, and I'm wondering, did you get a chance to use Vedic universal dependency tree bank? I believe you know already. Oliver Helwig is already developed 4,000 something tokens, and Sanskrit universal dependency for prose text is available.
Yeah, but no, we were not. I mean, at the time, which is 2 years ago, when I was teaching at JNU, and that's when I made pre-active. And then, so that's when I was working with Girish Nath to see what was available in terms of the tools. And when I came here to Oxford, then we started looking into what could be applied. We played with a couple of tools, didn't work. And then that's when we decided, let's not waste more time with this.
No, I agree, because I'm aware with Girishnath Jha's work. I did my PhD under Professor Jha, so I'm fully aware what is the...
You're familiar, yeah, exactly. Well, yeah.
Sanskrit Center. So, and I know properly what is the drawback of the tools and why we are not able to share the... But recently, we know we are upgrading the information and tools, so you can check NPTL.
I'll do that too. It's never too late.
Yeah, sure. So this is the link. You can check.
Oh, thank you.
So thank you so much.
Okay, thanks. Any other questions? Okay, if not, I'd like to thank our speaker again. Very interesting talk. Thank you so much for letting us know something about Sanskrit grammar. And I hope to see you again at the next seminar in this series.
Oh, yes. Thank you very much for the invitation. And I hope that I encourage some of you technical people to work on Sanskrit, since you see the need we have for good and reliable tools. So if any of you are interested in what we are doing in the project, the other topics, etc., or the code that I'm using, etc., then you can just contact me via email, and we can continue our discussion there.
Okay, that's great. Thank you so much.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.